en del telefoner. Der får vi e-poster fra diverse som
Hjertelig velkommen til alle sammen. Og noen av dere med fra det forrige møtet. Jeg kjenner igjen noen ansikter. Men de aller fleste av dere nye og kommer for denne sesjonen her, som heter Skatt og sårbarhet. Det vi skal gjøre, det å lansere en ny forskningsrapport fra CMI og NUPI, som UD har finansiert. Og jeg satt sammen med forskningsdirektøren vår i fjor sommer, og så hadde vi denne rammebevilgningen til forskning. Og så sa jeg, ja, hva det vi virkelig trenger litt forskning på? Og så var det sommerferie, og det var ingen som kunne gjøre det. Og så bare satte jeg meg ned og skrev en terms of reference. Og så hadde vi akkurat hatt Forskningsrådet som hadde holdt en presentasjon, hvor de viste hvor effektfullt det kan være å investere i forskning. Og så hadde jeg et eksempel hvor de sa at de målte det opp mot indikatoren hvor mange ganger forskeren var sitert i internasjonale forskningsarbeider. Og så løftet de opp Odd-Helge Fjeldstad på skjermen og sa at dette her vel anvendt. Og så hadde de også noen tallberegninger for hvor mye penger som utviklingsland som hadde da blitt utsatt for forskning, hadde tjent. Ikke sant? At det var, ja, du kan si noe om det selv kanskje, men det var ganske overveldende. Dette her god bistand, dette kanskje noe av den beste bistanden vi kan gi, ifølge da det Forskningsrådet og andre evalueringer, Riksrevisjonen, evalueringsenheten, Verdensbankens evalueringer. Og dette her handler om å sette utviklingsland i stand til å bli bistandsuavhengige. Det kjernen i arbeidet. Så først litt praktisk. Vi har akkurat hatt et møte om digitalisering i utviklingspolitikken. Vi jobber med en strategi der. Da tester vi ut nye digitale virkemidler. Og digitalisering skal også da skje innenfor dette feltet. Og vi hørte en gründer som fortalte hvordan han har jobbet med digitalisering og skatt i Democratic Republic of Congo og møtt på enorme utfordringer der. Men da, hvis dere går opp på Slido, så det noen spørsmål vi har lagt inn der som dere kan svare på og gi deres mening om, som vi vil ta med oss videre. Og så har vi noen hashtags som dere kan bruke hvis dere vil twitre eller legge kommentarer på Facebook eller dele på annen måte. Og før CMI og NUPI presenterer rapporten som UD har finansiert, så vil utviklingsminister Nikolai Astrup innlede.
Tusen takk for det. Velkommen. Hyggelig å se så mange her, og også se at det noen som var på det forrige seminaret, fordi disse tingene henger jo sammen. Rapporten som CMI legger frem i dag viktig. Både sårbarhetsstrategien fra i fjor, som et strategisk rammeverk for innsats i sårbare stater og regioner, og det faktum at nasjonal ressursmobilisering har blitt viktigere i utviklingspolitikken, tilsier at vi må innhente mer kunnskap om dette feltet. Her i Norge så snakker vi ofte om at vi får mye gratis. Skolen gratis, helsehjelp gratis, men alle vet jo at det jo egentlig ikke gratis. Det skattefinansiert. Og det kan være verdt å minne oss selv på, og spesielt i arbeidet med å bidra til utvikling i resten av verden. For det jo der, som her, utviklingen må finansieres, og det får man ikke til uten skatteinntekter. Jeg tror heller ikke at det blir mindre viktig fremover. Med dagens utvikling så vil 60% av verdens fattige bo i sårbare stater i 2030. Man må smøre bremsene sine. Hvis vi skal nå bærekraftsmålene, så må vi øke den nasjonale ressursmobiliseringen i utviklingsland. Vi vet at utvikling først og fremst må finansieres av landenes egne ressurser, og at bistanden bare kan utgjøre en liten del av løsningen. Og det gir oss en ganske klar konklusjon. Skal vi nå målet om å utrydde fattigdom innen 2030, er det tvingende nødvendig å øke skatteinngangen i sårbare stater. Og det er ikke en lett jobb. Det er faktisk ganske komplisert. Skattesystemene er nært knyttet til regimene og myndighetene i et land. Tilliten de nyter og forholdet de har til egen befolkning. Og derfor er det viktig at vi samarbeider tett med dem som har erfaring med dette. Vi må søke den beste kompetansen og analysen som er tilgjengelig. Kunnskapsbasert politikk er ofte den politikken som gir best resultater. Heldigvis så har vi flere gode og relevante forskningsmiljøer i Norge. De kommer vi til å benytte oss av, nå som vi trapper opp innsatsen på skatt i utviklingspolitikken. Denne rapporten fra CMI, som er bestilt av UD, er et godt første steg. Det er ifølge forskning 4 hovedårsaker til at land ikke klarer å oppnå fremgang i kampen mot fattigdom. Det ene er svake og ineffektive myndighetsstrukturer, svak privat sektor, konflikt og vold, og sårbarhet som følge av klimaendringer og miljøforringelse. En ting er at nasjonal ressursmobilisering og skattesystemer er vanskelig i seg selv. Noe annet er å lykkes med det i sårbare stater. Innsats i land i direkte eller indirekte konflikt med store humanitære utfordringer og høy grad av sårbarhet krever en annen tilnærming enn mer stabile land. Sikkerhetssituasjonen gjør tilstedeværelse og kontroll vanskeligere. Det er også risiko for at oppnådde resultater kan ødelegges når konflikt og vold blusser opp igjen. Skal det internasjonale giversamfunnet lykkes i å skape utvikling og utrydde ekstrem fattigdom i disse landene, krever det nytenkning i hvordan bistand gis, hvordan samarbeid forankres hos nasjonale myndigheter, og fleksibilitet og langsiktighet. På fredag så la regjeringen frem en egen stortingsmelding om hvilke partnerland Norge skal søke samarbeid med fremover. Sårbare stater er en av 2 partnerlandkategorier, og vil ha en stor plass i fremtidens utviklingspolitikk. Det følger derfor logisk at Norge må finne måter vi kan bidra til mer effektiv nasjonal ressursmobilisering i sårbare stater. Økt skatteinngang er ikke bare et spørsmål om å få økonomien til å gå rundt. Det er også et politisk spørsmål om eierskap. Skatt er i realiteten innbyggeres investering i offentlig sektor. Slik er det med investeringer generelt. Jo mer man investerer, jo tettere engasjerer man seg. Jo bredere en stats skattegrunnlag er, jo bredere vil også innbyggernes eierskap til staten og offentlige tjenester være. Vi politikere jobber bedre når skattebetalerne holder oss ansvarlige med spørsmål som hva har du gjort for meg i det siste? Hva har du gjort med de skattepengene jeg har jobbet hardt for å tjene inn? Hvor ble det av det sykehuset og de skolene du lovet å bygge? Når politikerne skjerper seg, da brukes offentlige midler bedre. Og når offentlige midler brukes bedre, da blir skattebetalerne villige til å betale mer skatt. Det er en positiv spiral. Ambisjonen er klar, men metoden Norge skal velge for å oppnå dette målet er ikke fullt så innlysende. Derfor er rapportens 9 anbefalinger viktige for oss. Jeg gleder meg til å diskutere disse mer i detalj, men la meg begynne debatten allerede nå med å dele noen av mine tanker. Det første gjelder politisk vilje, og det er som kjent en fornybar ressurs, så det er positivt. I mine måneder som utviklingsminister så er det en lærdom jeg har fått gjentatt flere ganger. Det er avgjørende med politisk vilje i utviklingslandet hvis vi skal lykkes. Når det gjelder skatt, så betyr det at de myndigheter vi samarbeider med må ha motivasjon til å gjennomføre en reform av de ineffektive og urettferdige systemene. De må være villige til å føre en demokratisk og korrupsjonsfri finanspolitikk, og til slutt levere grunnleggende tjenester for befolkningen. Og det er jo lett å uttrykke en slik ambisjon. Nesten hvilken som helst politisk leder vil jo kunne si at det er målet. Men vi må også sikre at det politiske lederskapet reelt sett er beredt til å ta vanskelige valg, agere på vegne av egen befolkning og styre unna korrupsjon når det virkelig gjelder. Det andre handler om bistandens metode. Mange års erfaring viser at langsiktighet i samarbeidet er viktig for å styrke den statlige kapasiteten. Det tar tid å opparbeide nødvendig tillit. Og ikke minst tar det tid før kunnskapen institusjonaliseres. Samarbeid innenfor Kunnskapsbanken, og herunder da Skatt for utvikling, har derfor en horisont på 10 til 15 år. Andre sentrale forutsetninger tilstedeværelse og kontekstforståelse, noe som innebærer at den faglige ekspertisen må kunne tilpasse seg, og at løsningen som velges svarer på landenes egne behov. Sårbare stater ofte karakterisert av raske endringer i maktforhold, gjentakende kriser og en krevende sikkerhetssituasjon. Og det betyr at vi vil ikke lykkes uten tilstedeværelse, kontekstforståelse og langsiktighet. Det tredje handler om at økt skatteinngang like viktig som det politisk sensitivt. Vi kjenner det fra den politiske debatten her hjemme. Eiendomsskatt, arveavgift, formuesskatt, toppskatt, bunnfradrag. Det engasjerer enormt, og kanskje mer enn det burde. Men betydningen av nasjonalt eierskap kan ikke overdrives i dette arbeidet i de landene vi her snakker om. Det viktig at ikke nasjonale myndigheter skylder på internasjonale givere og finansinstitusjoner når de skal forsvare omlegging av egne skattesystemer. De må heller bidra til å bygge tillit og oppslutning om det nye skattesystemet. Ikke skape grobunn for misnøye og uro. I dag Norges skatt for utviklingsprogram aktivt i 2 land, Tanzania og Mosambik. I tillegg jobber vi med skatterelaterte spørsmål gjennom olje for utvikling. Nylig signerte vi en samarbeidsavtale med skatteetaten som vil tilføre 3 til 5 nye land til porteføljen. Vi vil også øke samarbeid med Verdensbanken, IMF, OECD og FN for å støtte deres arbeid med dette. Og vår ambisjon klar. Vi skal nå vårt løfte under Address Tax Initiative om å doble skatterelatert bistand før 2020. Og det skal vi ikke bare fordi vi har forpliktet oss til å gjøre det. Det skal vi fordi dette en type bistand som har enorm katalytisk effekt. $1 brukt fra oss kan tilføre statene kanskje opp mot $100 i nye ressurser. Stort mer effektivt enn det blir det ikke, og det kan gi varig utvikling for folk som trenger det, og sette landet i stand til å investere i velferd og offentlige tjenester. Men det er også en form for bistand som vanskelig og krever mye kunnskap og ekspertise, og derfor så jeg veldig glad for at vi fikk til dette seminaret i dag. Det en god start på en spennende debatt om hvordan vi skal lykkes på dette feltet i praksis. Tusen takk.
So, we're expecting English-speaking panelist. Has she arrived yet?
She will arrive in a minute.
Okay. Så da snakker jeg norsk til hun kommer inn av døren. Nå vil jeg gjerne introdusere Odd-Helge Fjeldstad og Morten Bøås. Odd-Helge seniorforsker på CMI, Christian Michelsen Institute, og Morten seniorforsker på NUPI, Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. De begge driver og simultanoversetter her. Jeg tar det på engelsk, They're both some of the world's leading experts and applied development research on taxation, governance and politics. So please, if you would like to take a seat here, and then Okay. Ja, så da presenterer du først. Skulle dere presentere sammen?
Ja, vi hopper litt inn og ut.
Ja, ok. Dere styrer det.
Tusen takk for innledningen, Astrup. Det her var musikk i mine ører. Lenge var jo skatt et ikke-tema innenfor utviklingspolitikk og bistand. En var fokusert på hvordan pengene skulle brukes, og hvordan de skulle genereres, og bidra til at disse landene ble selvberget. Det var et ikke-tema. Det har endret seg i løpet av de siste årene. Og Norge har jo også vært en pådriver i den endringsprosessen. Og Norge har også en høy standing nå internasjonalt når det gjelder skatt for utvikling, basert blant annet på arbeidet som gjort innenfor den norske skatteadministrasjonen, Skattedirektoratet sitt arbeid i Tanzania og Mosambik og Zambia, men også innenfor forskning, så har det blitt lagt ned merke til at det skjer noe i Norge. Og Norge har jo også vært aktiv i viktige internasjonale fora for å sette skatt for utvikling på agendaer innenfor OECD, innenfor ulike trust funds i regi av Verdensbanken, IMF. Men, som også Astrup påpekte, det er utfordringer i mange, og det er fortsatt så er det mye som må gjøres, og det er fortsatt også et behov for å generere mer kunnskap, spesielt i forhold til at kontekstene varierer betydelig. Og den langsiktige perspektivet som ble skissert i innledningen tror jeg er fryktelig viktig å ha med seg. Nå tenkte jeg at jeg skulle gå over til engelsk. Jalia kommer sikkert inn døra ganske snart. Så jeg tenkte å si litt først om bakgrunnen for studien, og så hvordan vi har tenkt å organisere prestasjonen. The Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has developed a strategic framework for Norwegian efforts in fragile states and regions, which is aimed at countries that are directly or indirectly affected by conflicts. This framework emphasizes that efforts in conflict situations require a different approach and other means than in more stable countries. And this is the point of departure for this study, which is co-authored with Morten Bøås here, and also with Frida, where are you? Yeah, and Julia. They have been working as assistants for us. Both are master students of economics from University of Oslo, and both are now also research assistants at NUPI. Tremendous work. So here we have also, it's not only about these old timers like Morten and me who are getting involved. I think it's very important to really now put more emphasis on recruiting young, promising researchers who really have a passion for this work. So it has been great working with Frida and Julia. The purpose of the study is to systematize and analyze existing knowledge on taxation in fragile states. And on that basis, the study discusses possible entry points for Norwegian support to domestic resource mobilization in ways that may contribute to strengthen state building and improve government legitimacy in fragile states. The report includes a number of case studies which clearly illustrates that context matters. We will not go into these details in this presentation, but have a broader sweep on some major issues, major challenges and opportunities for Norwegian approaches to support the building of tax systems in these in countries which are characterized with instability and or conflict. So we have organized the presentation of the study in a way which implies that Morten and I will jump in and out. And I think now, Morten, it is your turn to jump in.
Thank you, Odd-Helge. It's on animation, right? Yeah. Otherwise, I'll just start.
This is one of the few things Morten and I are not 100% aligned with. That is, I like the animations. He goes straight to the point.
I like to get straight to the point. I mean, when we are discussing issues concerning fragile states and taxation, I mean, we need to start by having some discussion about what do we mean by fragility, what do we mean by a fragile state in this context. And there are plenty of definitions and approaches to fragile states, from OECD to IMF to the World Bank to tons of academic writing on this subject matter. We believe that it's important to acknowledge that fragility has many faces. Fragile states share some important commonalities, but they also have quite different features. Some are just generally weak with weak state capacity. Others are in this category, which I will come back to, which we call the no peace, no conflict. Others are in a state of conflict, which means that one needs to have different approaches and different ways of understanding the logic of these states. They simply will not do with just having one policy towards taxation and fragile states. One needs to be context and conflict sensitive in this matter. That said, I mean, when we talk about fragile states, we see fragile states as states whose monopoly on violence is either undermined or at the risk of being undermined. And in some of these countries, also in some of the countries in our study, which are countries that Norway will emphasize in this regard, we find that armed non-state groups are just as relevant for people's livelihoods as the bureaucratic machinery of the state. And this is something that one needs to acknowledge and take into considerations, because this is the reality on the ground in places like Mali, Somalia, and South Sudan. Which also to us suggests that some of these definitions and approaches to fragile states, and here we are a little critical both of the OECD definition and the IMF definition and approaches. We see them as sometimes too broad to be very meaningful, and also at times too technocratic. And the problem with a technocratic approach to this particular subject matter is that it can frame the world in such a way that context and conflict sensitivity disappears out of the equation. This is the question of tax and taxation can never be reduced to a technocratic issue and question. These are deeply political issues. And if we are to work meaningfully with this, we need to acknowledge and understand also the political dimension to this. How does this work in the case of Mali, in Somalia, in South Sudan, and so on? In the 6 countries with a need for stabilization and conflict prevention that has been targeted as focus countries for Norwegian support, which are Niger, Palestine, Mali, Afghanistan, Somalia, and South Sudan, we believe what we do in this report is that we divide these 6 countries into 2 subgroups. Subgroup A, which we call semi-fragile, no peace, no war situations. These are the countries where certain key tasks are still performed by the state. Examples here could be Niger and Palestine. And then we have what we call fragile in conflict states, where state authority is directly challenged or has more or less collapsed. This is what we find in large parts of Afghanistan, Mali, Somalia, and South Sudan. And we need to treat these 2 different groups of states separately, or at least have different approaches to them. That said, I mean, there are also some important similarities here, and which we sum up in this table. I mean, as you can see, I mean, we separate between state of fragility that is predominantly dominated by conflict, Afghanistan, Mali, Somalia, South Sudan, or this more sort of no peace, no war situation of Palestine, Niger. But what we do find here is that all these states tend to be extremely dependent on natural resources. We also find that taxation is constitutes a very small percentage of their GDP, whereas the share of the total labor force in the informal sector is enormous. Here I need to just add that, of course, another big challenge by working with this kind of state is that the data material, in this case the figures, are highly uncertain. And that's another challenge dealing with these kind of states, that we really don't have at present the data material really needed. There's a lot of things we simply do not know about these countries. But still, I mean, these trends are for real. And we would also like to point out that there is a problem when you have so much of the labor force in the informal sector. there is lots of challenges related to that, but particularly also with regard to taxation, because it also means that you have a large percentage of the population is what we may call a floating population, not really embedded in the formal economy at all. And that represents yet another challenge, both for taxation in itself, but also for how to think about the relationship between taxation and a possible social contract. Which leads us then, building state capacity in fragile states, is it just a dream in vain? First, I mean, it's clear that fragile states represents huge challenges for the international community. I mean, we talk about issues concerning social fragmentation, being conflict prone and so on and so forth, all enormous challenges in itself. But perhaps the biggest challenge is the lack of an institutional response capacity in such countries that makes it difficult for international interventions, no matter what they are, to really succeed. So, is this a dream in vain? Well, we believe not. Because we know what is needed to bring a country like Mali out of the current security predicament. It needs stability and institutions that can extract revenue from taxes, fees, and duties. Initiating such processes has never been easy anyway, and we need to remember that. Historically, this is the most difficult question in the whole state-building process. This has never been easy anyway, and we need to keep that in mind. But of course, particularly difficult in countries with weak regimes, low administrative capacity, but also low levels of legitimacy. And countries that are also socially fragmented and conflict prone. So this is an enormous task that we are confronted with here. But there is really no alternative to try to confront this challenge. And the reason for this is that by not making the attempt, it simply means that these countries are doomed to remain permanently on some sort of artificial international life support. Which also then suggests that we will have massive international interventions in these countries without any real exit strategies or opportunities. So basically, we don't have any choice than to try this, even if it will be difficult and there will be several setbacks in this process. So, if taxation is key to recovery from fragility, how? We believe, and this is a key argument in this report, that we need to start unpacking the black box that such countries have become. We need to understand the similarities and differences between them, and we need to have not one policy but several that are context and conflict sensitive. We really need to understand how these countries actually work, because they do work. It's just that they don't necessarily work how we would like them to work or how we think they should work. But here there are also things that works. We need to understand and investigate how relatively, and we stress relatively, because this will not be perfect from day one. This will be a long-term struggle to achieve. How relatively transparent and legitimate regimes for taxation can be established, exercised, and maintained over time. And if we are to achieve this, we need to base this on a grounded understanding of where authority is located, how it operates, and what incentive structures that are in existence. We need to, Astrup was talking about motivation, and motivation is the key here. But the motivation also means that we need to understand the real incentive structures among the political elites of such places. And we need to realize that establishing or improving tax regimes in fragile states is all about finding the right balance between coercion and legitimacy. What we mean by this is just that historically we know that this has never been a perfect Sunday school. This has always been established with some sort of coercion. You need a state that can put this into being. People in a place like Mali will not suddenly start paying a lot of taxes because the government tells them that from now on everything is going to be fine, so start paying your taxes and you'll immediately see a return from your money. People will not believe that, for very good reasons. Why should they believe that? But still you need to initiate this. So you need to have coercion, but you also need to relatively quickly be able to change from an approach to taxation that is mainly based on coercion to one that has increased levels of legitimacy. Otherwise it's not going to work. So you need to find that balance, and that will be part of the big issue here, is to try to help and facilitate the finding of that balance between coercion and legitimacy. Because if this balance can be established, it would also enable the making or remaking of new social contracts. Social contracts that in most of these countries currently simply do not exist or has become completely dysfunctional. So these are the challenges that we are faced with, and now I will leave it to Odd-Helge, who will say something about how in fact we can deal with these challenges.
Thank you, Morten. I will just first start with what do we know about taxation and state building. We know from our own history that taxation has been very important for developing the welfare state we have now. But we also know that taxation and state building has been a key issue in the development of many developing countries. It is very, very clear that and visible that the development of the East Asian tigers, South Korea and Taiwan, for instance, taxation was a key instrument used by the government then to develop the state and to get to engage business sector and the private sector in general. And this is also an issue which we have addressed in a forthcoming book, which comes, I think, in 10 days' time on SED. It's called Taxing Africa, where we also discuss this very closely and provide a lot of examples of this linkages between taxation and state building. It's a joint co-authored with Mick Moore and with Richard. And it's argued in the literature here and also historical experiences that a substantial governance dividend can be gained from mobilizing domestic financial resources through the tax system. This is the social fiscal contract or the tax bargaining model. Of course, it sounds very attractive, very appealing, and but as Morten also has emphasized, context matters, and there are a lot of challenges also in this process, and including balancing the issue of coercion and legitimacy. Well, taxation implies that the state has to interact with taxpayers, and that may lead to participation. It may lead the taxpayers also to claim something in return from the government, how taxes are spent, etc., and then you have the accountability dimension. This is a very simple, basic model which often is referred to. But we also know that robust fiscal institutions are essential for state building and economic growth, and in particular in the fragile states we are referring to in the report, fiscal institutions are of particular concern because of the massive destruction which one often have seen or experienced during the conflict in these countries. But using taxation as a way to promote the fiscal contract between its state and citizens is not given, and it's very context specific. Taxation can also be used as a means to promote divisions between different groups in society. And that is also what we have seen, for instance, when a government offers generous tax exemptions to business people who support them and introduce substantial tax investigation audits on opponents. We have seen that in a number of countries how the government has abused the tax system in that perspective. And taxation may leave segments of the poor population worse off. This is an argument by Nora Lustig, who says that the current tax system in poor countries is more regressive and has also led to more poverty. This is also a reason to question the findings of this, but one has to keep in mind that taxation not necessarily is by definition progressive. And predatory taxation has also in many cases produce revolts and widespread resistance by taxation. This is something we have seen in a number of countries. I've written also about this in countries like Tanzania and Uganda, and we see that also in other countries. So this is an advice in a recent ODI paper by Long and Miller. They say that encouraging extractive government to collect more taxes and keeping one's fingers crossed for governance dividend from taxation is likely to be naive at best and harmful at worst. And we also know that taxation is just a tool to achieve better development, to improve infrastructure and service delivery. So, what are the main challenges when it comes to raising tax revenues in fragile states? Well, in general, interstate conflicts, they reduce substantially often the formal tax collection due to the general disruption of economic activities and also of infrastructure and human capital, including destruction of public records and revenue statistics, shortage of skilled staff to draft legislation and administrate tax collection. And it also facilitates often capital flight, and corruption is a part of the picture, which Astrup also pointed at. And localization of the conflict matters for revenue generation. Whether the conflict is mainly taking place or affecting the more peripheral area or the urban areas. If it affects the capital city, we often see massive destruction of the revenue system. And also whether the conflict takes place in border areas which are important for customs and other economic activities and revenue generation. Often parallel systems of informal taxation emerge during conflicts. It is not so that people in conflict-ridden countries are not paying taxes. Often they pay a lot of different types of taxes or fees and charges. Often they experience massive extortion by armed rebel groups and also corrupt tax officials. And there has been studies, including from DRC, Congo, where one finds that up to 90% of people's income may actually be extracted in the form of informal, formal types of taxes, fees, charges, etc. And often generous tax exemptions are granted to companies mainly operating in the natural resource sectors, which also contribute to undermine public revenue generation. And it is also a matter of fact that the dependency on natural resources, which we see in countries like Mali, like Niger and other countries, that dependency also makes states more vulnerable for commodity price shock. Norway experienced that some years back with the oil price drop. But in these settings with vulnerable, fragile states, the impacts on price shock, negative price shock, can be much more damaging. And of course, intense conflict are likely to have major implications for post-conflict reform by destroying infrastructure, by destroying the databases, statistics, and capacity of the revenue administration and staff of the Ministry of Finance responsible for drafting legislation. So, but there are opportunities. Raising tax revenues in fragile states. Firstly, I think it's important to emphasize that before one moves in, and that was also emphasized by both Morten and Astrup here, that the context is extremely important. And it's also very unpredictable what happens on the ground. One can have perfect systems, like the IMF, which have suggested a more three-pronged strategy to build tax capacity. It is beautiful on paper, and for an economist like me, it makes sense. to start also to building the tax policy, legislative measures. But in practice, what matters is how to implement the strategy. It is not only a question about know-how, but also knowing who. This has to do with who has incentives to contribute, to support. Are the willingness, political willingness, and who are willing? And attention must also be paid to identifying entry points and priority for reform, and also possible threats to successful implementation of the reforms. Therefore, it is extremely important to understand the political economy of the country in question. Firstly, what is the nature of power and decision-making processes? Who are the actors? What are their incentives? What are their willingness here to enter into a constructive process towards building a tax system? How are revenues mobilized? Is it through customs? Is it natural resource mobilization? And what are then the most important sectors? Should one, for instance, get in a situation where customs often is a major revenue source, focus on developing, strengthen the customs instead of rolling out a more broad-based sales tax or VAT regime? Should one start by taxing large enterprises before one moves on to incorporate medium-sized and smaller enterprises? These are questions one has to take to consider, and they are very context-specific. This is something we also discuss and provide cases, examples of how this can be done, how are the experiences in different countries. What we have done, and that was the purpose of the report also, to come up, use our own research and knowledge, our consultations with literature, our consultation with people working in the field, in different agencies, and also discussing with the relevant officials in NORAD and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Then on that basis we have outlined 9 possible entry points for Norwegian support. Time is?
A few more minutes.
Okay, thank you. I think it's very important to emphasize that our recommendations, they are likely to differ substantially from country to country, depending on context and demand. And the recommendation, of course, they are tentative and should be considered as issues for further discussion and elaboration by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and NORAD in their efforts to operationalize this assistance. Firstly, when it comes to the recommendation 1, do no harm. Well, the practical question for Norway and other development partners is what can be done in countries where state legitimacy is low and in the face of opposition from interest groups of various kinds, and through the administrations that are corrupt, inefficient, and resistant to change. The first priority ambition must therefore do no harm. This implies more and better donor coordination together with an established process of in-depth country analysis. The second recommendation is that government ownership is a prerequisite for any policy reform, but it is particularly important for politically sensitive tax reforms. And in fragile settings characterized by widespread corruption and ineffective public institutions, there is a real danger that donors establish parallel systems outside the public sector to make things work. It is common that external tax experts in technical assistance projects become gap fillers and not capacity builders in revenue administration. And a large number of bilateral and multilateral donors that often are present in fragile settings, they have often diverse interests, and the different aid modalities adopted also create risks for duplication or fragmentation. Therefore, it is we emphasize in the report the importance of donor harmonization coordination, and also that multi-donor trust funds and other forms of pooled resources can be an important approach to create more collaboration among donors and recipients.
So, if I may just interrupt. You can continue on, we can keep that on, but I would like to, Development Minister Astrup, he needs to leave us now, but we'll continue the meeting with prepared comments from Dr. Jalia Kangave, and I would like to just introduce the two of you before you leave. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah. And then if you just finish up, and then.
So when it comes to recommendation 3, support customs administration, that is based on the fact that fragile states are, and the countries we are focusing on here, are very dependent on customs revenues. Import duties, excises, sales taxes on import goods, and in some cases also export fees. They are one of the major revenue sources. So reforming and strengthening customs should be a priority also for donor assistance. This also implies that one should also consider to work more closely with the World Customs Organization. And in Norway, we have also the Directorate of Norwegian Customs, which would be relevant to engage in a multilateral work on these issues. Taxation on alcohol and tobacco is also part of that issue. Recommendation 4, capacity management and taxation of natural resources. Again, because natural extractive sectors, in particular mining, are prominent in several other countries targeted by Norway, in particular Afghanistan, Mali, and Niger. And one possible entry point for Norwegian support is the Managing Natural Resource Wealth Trust Fund, which is now operated by the IMF. The general recommendation is that bilateral intervention by Norway is something we would not recommend due to the lack of experience in Norway due to security reasons. But pooling resources with multilateral agencies might be a more productive way. And Norway is providing funding to a number of trust funds, both in the World Bank and the IMF, which we then also can use as an entry point to influence the way these multilateral organizations operate. For instance, to put more emphasis on environmental and social issues in the cases. I just dropped number 5, which I think is important, but a bit on the sideline. Then improve tax administration relations. That is recommendation 6. This is partly due to the fact that economic active citizens in fragile states, they belong to the informal sector. Tax literacy is in general poor, and many people are not able to comprehend the technical issues of paying taxes. Here, the Global Tax Program and the Revenue Mobilization Trust Funds of the World Bank and the IMF might be good entry points. And Norway, in particular the Norwegian Tax Administration, they have extensive experience in designing and implementing so-called soft compliance methods, which can also contribute to influence the approaches of the multilateral trust funds. Don't forget the subnational taxes. That has been very often ignored. But subnational taxes, and often extensive, different, it's a complete mess often, and they have huge impacts on the, in particular, small and micro enterprises and their survival. Support civil society organizations, civil-based organizations. It is vital for the legitimacy of the tax system to secure a broad citizen engagement around taxation. And civil-based organizations, including business associations, can help broaden the debate and bring a new focus on the discussion of tax policy. For instance, fairness and influence then policy decisions. But there is a need to map which civil society organizations are operating in the specific country, how they work, and on what topics. And finally, develop research capacity. There is a need for more research that produces concrete, contextualized, and policy-relevant insights on whether and how taxation can contribute to broader state-building goals in fragile countries. We have some expertise in Norway. We have at NUPI, CMI, PRIO, also at the University at Norra Greek. Also the Tax Cap Dev Network, which is initiated by the Research Council, is one forum where we try to link up the resources and strengthen the capacity and research capacity by linking researchers and different research environment to focus more and collaborate on issues related to taxation. And then also internationally, Norway has been instrumental in the establishment of the International Center for Tax and Development. We work closely there. And finally, the African Tax Administration Forum, which organizes 38 African countries' tax administration, is also an entry point which should be considered. Then, my time is far way out. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, a little bit over time, but so, you know, this is really what is key for the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to base its policies on. And with this meta study that you have conducted, is just absolutely vital to, like your first point, do no harm, basically. And I would like to now, before I take you up, our next speaker is from the UK, and relating to the do no harm, we all know Robin Hood and the Sheriff of Nottingham as a terrible example of exploitive taxation. And Dr. Jalia Kangave is our next speaker. She is working at the International Center for Tax and Development and Research Fellow of Institute for Development Studies in Brighton. And she's also Capacity Building Manager and Gender and Tax Program Lead at this institute. So I would like to give you a very warm welcome and thank you for coming all the way to Norway. Unfortunately, we can't provide very good weather for you today. But please take the floor and provide us with your prepared comments.
I hope I'm going to be loud enough. Okay, good afternoon. First of all, thank you for the invitation, and also thank you to the authors for preparing such a comprehensive report. I'm not going to, I don't plan to do any harm, so I'll just provide general comments, first of all, on what I think about the report, and then provide some highlights of areas that I think are really important to emphasize, and then just a little bit of emphasis on some work that we have done in conflict areas. I found the report extremely useful for a number of reasons. First of all, the definition of fragility, like being able to understand that there are various definitions of fragility is very good in terms of contextualizing what we're talking about. I also found it useful that the report underscores the importance of having, first of all, general guidelines on how we should deal with taxation in fragile states, but then also recognizes the fact that these states may have various similarities, but they're not the same. So context is going to be really important in this respect. It also acknowledges the fact that while domestic resource mobilization is important, we need to analyze tax systems with a very critical question in mind. Who is benefiting from taxation? Is it the poor people, or is it the people in power? And there are various useful discussions on the fiscal contract, as Odd has said. We fantasize about what it means to have this fiscal contract, but does taxation necessarily mean representation? These, I think, are really useful questions to think about. We are also provided in the report with a general impression of what happens in different countries that have had conflict and what reforms and what progress they have made in making reforms to their tax system. And so I think that's a useful entry point, and one that will be useful to go into further detail to understand what has worked in these countries, what can we learn from that country, and what extent can we bring the lessons from that country to put them into the countries that we're dealing with. Then also generally, the report, while the authors acknowledge that it's difficult to have really concrete recommendations to take forward, they give us very tangible entry points into ways in which we can start thinking about how to approach taxation in fragile states. I'd like to highlight some aspects of the report that I felt were extremely useful. One of them was to ask the important question of who are the agents of change? Our research has shown us that you can introduce all types of reforms, but unless you have the right people behind you, unless you have the buy-in, you can have the best research, you can have the best reforms, but if the people in power, whether you're talking about a conflict country or a country that doesn't have conflict, if those people who are the ones who are going to implement change do not buy into that, then it's going to be useless. So I thought that's really important to emphasize. Who are the agents of change? Because these really determine the extent to which success can be achieved. Related to this is the need to think about how to approach the people in those different government systems, because what we have found in working with many revenue authorities is that there are normally solutions on the ground. The people might not have like a lot of technical expertise, but they have a lot of understanding of the way things on the ground work. And so it's important to acknowledge that that's an equally useful contribution to how things are going to work when you're looking at that in conjunction with the technical assistance. So asking important questions, how can we serve you, right? They have the answers, and so it's important in looking at the change leaders to also be open to understanding how the systems in that country work. The other one is the observation that, you know, we're normally talking about increasing taxation, and there is sometimes a perception that we should tax more. The report highlights the fact that one of the things we should ask is not necessarily what more should we tax, but how can we tax better? Because many times in the countries that we've worked, and these are not really fragile states, but this would also be applicable, is you find that there are actually laws in place. The fragile states might be a bit different, but there are systems in place that allow the government or the revenue authorities to tax to go ahead. So they have the policies in place. The question is, these policies are not implemented. So it's important when going into the countries to then try and balance between the two, find out, is the legislative framework robust enough? If it's not robust enough, then what is missing? Is it a question of really the laws, or is it a question of implementation of the laws? The third one, which I'm going to talk more extensively about, and it's my final point, is to ask the question, what do we mean by taxation? Because many times when we think about taxation, we think about the mainstream kind of taxes, we think about income taxes, we think about things like VAT, we think about customs and excise, but we find that particularly in fragile states, there's a lot of what we call informal taxes, right? So we find that people are paying, you know, community, they are paying what is being paid in Western countries to finance public expenditure. So people will contribute to, you know, pay health workers, they'll contribute to paying teachers, they'll put up things that the state would have provided. And so since the state has failed, you find that there are a lot of payments that are going into things like that, which are not really captured in the budget. And so it's important to then try and flip the definition of what we mean by taxes, because it's not what we understand as taxation, but the truth is it's taking money out of people's pockets, and it is being used to provide a service. So that's one critical one, and one that I'm going to spend some time talking about, because we've done some research in Sierra Leone, for example. So in 2010, there was a survey that was conducted in Sierra Leone, and it's around 1,100 households, the different kinds of taxes that they paid, the different kinds of fees, the different kinds of levies, but also just different kinds of payment. And that research found that 69% of the household paid at least one formal tax in the previous 12 months of that research. And in total, informal taxes made up almost 29% of the total tax payments that were being made. Another, interesting finding in that particular research was the manner in which those taxes affected the rich vis-a-vis the way they affected the poor. So in that particular study, it was found that those in the lowest income quintile paid an equivalent of 16% of their income in informal taxes, when compared to about 7% that was being paid by those in the highest income quintile. So there is a question of regressiveness, and again, underscoring why it's important to look at some of these other things that, Odd has said, they can be quite messy, but they are the reality of what is happening on the ground. So in that research, they defined informal taxes to include, various payments that are either made to state agents or non-state agents. So in other words, there were either bribes to the state agents, or there were other things that were paid, community development projects, watch guards, in areas where there's insecurity, and all other kinds of payments. A follow-up research that was then conducted in Sierra Leone and DRC found similar things, but just a number of things to note about that. First of all, they found that these payments could be quite extensive, like the informal payments were found to be quite extensive. They were found to be regressive in nature, but what was also interesting about them is that they were often linked to accessing services, right? So sometimes they're paid to chiefs or other parties who provide a service, and so some of the people felt like, this actually serves us well, because at least we're seeing a service. When the money goes to government, we don't necessarily see a service. So it was really an interesting finding. And then there was also, and the other thing with these payments is the fuzziness between what we see as formal and what we see as informal. Because in a study that was conducted in the DRC for the period between 2015 and 2017, the majority of the payments that were made to state agents, often disguised as formal payments, did not necessarily make it to the budget. Right? So people are paying, they think they're paying to a government agent, but then those payments are not necessarily making it to the budget. Sometimes they actually get receipts for the payments that they make, but they don't necessarily make it to the budget. I mean, it's with payments such as this, they are for a technical tax person. They are messy, they don't fit our definition of what it means to talk about taxation. But if they're actually coming out of people's pockets, then we cannot, we cannot look away from them, we cannot ignore them. And so we need to open ourselves up to trying to understand how they work and then try to find a way of going forward. And so what does this then mean for donors like Norway? First of all, like I said, I'd like to emphasize the fact that the report provides quite comprehensive recommendations of entry points. This is, these are some of the things that we should do. This is where we should go. So I'm not going to repeat those because Odd has already gone through them. So what I'm doing is simply adding a component of this informal kind of tax for purposes of what are the ways we should think about going forward. And so essentially, what the research is finding in conflict areas is that there are two kinds of actors that are involved. There are state actors who are receiving money informally, and then there are non-state actors who, are receiving money informally, but sometimes actually, providing services that are needed. So in terms of informally, in terms of state actors receiving bribes, what are the ways, to go about that, and what ways can be supported? Again, it goes back to, I guess, some of the traditional ways that you try to work with countries in terms of putting in place controls that, for example, would reduce face-to-face interventions, like face-to-face interactions between taxpayers and tax administrators. So whether that means automating systems, down the road and providing support for such a thing so that there's, less interaction between the two, and so that will reduce the opportunities for engaging in such things. Issues to do with incentives, and which has been seen to work in other countries, which have no fragility, but which could be useful lessons to carry forward, of incentives. Revenue authorities in other countries, African countries, what they have done is to pay, the tax officials quite favorably so that they attract, more competent staff, but also possibly remove the need to engage in corruption. It doesn't really do away with it, but at least we can argue that it reduces, because one of the arguments that is put forth for some of the engagement in corruption is that they're collecting money to pay themselves because they're not being paid by government, So how about supporting systems which, pay well, attract, the best, and also hopefully reduce corruption? The other one is legislative support, and so for this one, it's about really looking at what laws are in place and trying to simplify them. So the research in the DRC, for example, found that the national tax legislation had almost 500 different types of taxes at the provincial and local level, right? So there were 500 different types of taxes. In one of the provinces, there were about 200 different types of taxes, but only a handful of those were being actually used. The problem of making such, such a widespread, definition of taxes is then it becomes more complex, but then you also open it up more to abuse, you know, because the taxpayers won't know what's a tax, what's not a tax, because there's just so much. I mean, think about 500, if you had to pay 500 different types of taxes, it becomes really complicated. So part of it is simply looking at the countries that are involved and just thinking, okay, what are the laws saying? Are there ways that we can actually simplify these laws to make it easier for people to comply, and also to make it easier to administer on the part of tax administrations? And then the other thing that, again, has been mentioned in the report and again in this talk is to fund more empirical studies, because what's going to happen in DRC is not necessarily going to be the same as what's happening in Mali. It's not going to be the same as what's happening in Nigeria. And we find that even within countries, different locations are going to experience different problems. So the taxes in those, especially the informal taxes in those areas, are going to look different. So empirical studies are then going to support, one, the understanding of the donor of what exactly you're dealing with, because the contexts are going to be quite different in the different countries. So in terms of recommendations, that's a really important one to also underline. And then also an aspect of finding means to support taxpayer education. Different initiatives, either through civil society or through, like, even whether we're talking about taxpayers, but then you also can look at parliamentarians and what's their understanding of taxation. So these initiatives of taxpayer education, both of policymakers but also of taxpayers, are quite relevant. Yeah, I'm about to finish. So in terms of, so the other question then is what then do you do with these payments, which they're not taxes, but they are funding, you know, they are providing something that the state is not providing. And so for that one, the researchers had like engagement with different stakeholders in Sierra Leone, and they acknowledge and they say, you know, yes, we know, and what they're doing is illegal, but then right now we really cannot, you know, fund, we really cannot provide those services. So they acknowledge that these chiefs or whatever, they are actually providing a useful service. So in the short term is to find ways, how do the two work together? How do you how do you bargain between the two actors with a long-term goal of actually formalizing this collection of taxes? Just one quick one regarding, again, at the subnational level, is how do you support decentralization? Because a lot of this is happening at the local government level. But as the report says as well, we have to be careful to do no harm. So many decentralization efforts have started off well, but then they end up making matters worse sometimes. So we need to step back and ask ourselves, what is this working for this particular country, and how can we support it? And if not, then, you know, look elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johnny, and if you would like to join us, and now we open up the floor for questions. So please just raise your hand, and then we'll just...
Hi, Bjørn Kjellmo. Does this work? Yeah. Hi, Bjørn Kjellmo from the Research Council. First of all, thank you for a very good report and for good presentations. I just wanted to underline that also the Research Council has had a program under the Norge Global Development Program for a number of years called Taxation, Capital Streams and Development. And I think your report also underlines the need for more research in this area. Just a few questions and comments. You have all touched upon the links between corruption and taxation. And one question would be, to what extent is it possible to implement sustainable taxation systems in countries with widespread corruption? Another question goes with something that Dr. Kagada touched upon concerning complexity. Tax systems are rather blunt instruments, or they can be very fine-tuned instruments. If they are fine-tuned and then try to be as fair as possible, they are often very complex. So they need a lot of information, you need a lot of verification of information, etc., etc. In what end do you start? Do you start with blunt and a little bit unfair, or do you start with complex systems? And my third comment touches upon the links with the previous seminar that we had on digitalization and the digital revolution and technologies, and the links to taxation, which I think represent both opportunities and challenges. Opportunities maybe through digital system to leapfrog some of the development stages that industrialized countries have, but also challenges that we see not only in developing countries but also in countries all over the world. How do we tax multinational global companies where you don't really know where they are? These are challenges in Norway, and I think there are challenges in developing countries as well. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I think at the back there, if we could have some help, get some help to open some windows, because we've had the first this morning session and now this session, and it's starting to get a little bit stuffy, so we need some air. Yes. I'll collect a few questions and then we'll give the word to the panelists again.
Hi, my name is Peter Ringstad. I'm with Tax Justice Network Norway. We've also been collaborating in the tax the network with NUPI and CMI. Thank you for a very good introduction to this topic. I wanted to touch upon the issue of building legitimacy that what Morten and Odd-Helge was talking about. Particularly, how can we use transparency as a tool in building legitimacy? Because we see that people feel that they are being taxed, so they look at a couple of things. What are other people paying in tax? So transparency on taxpayers, and how is the money being spent? So transparency on spending. We see on the transparency of taxpayers that a lot of large multinationals are actually quite intransparent in how they organize their business and how much they contribute in tax. So how can we link the issue of building better tax institutions with building better systems of transparency, both in terms of the taxpayers, particularly the companies, and in terms of spending, so that people can see that when they contribute, they actually get services in the other end.
Excuse me, if you could help open the other windows as well. Yes? Then I know you had a question for the previous session. Okay. Any other questions? Yes? Okay. I'll start here and then you can hand it over afterwards.
Thank you very much. I'm Bjørn from Telenor Group. I was also here at the previous session, which was about digitalization for development, and tax is a component of that as well. I think after having read the CMI report, it's easy to more or less fully concur with your findings. And it's tempting to give some comment from the field on how this actually works in practice, but the time doesn't allow it. But of course, one paramount issue that we face in fragile states like Pakistan, Myanmar, etc., is that taxes easily get totally regressive. Typical profile for us is that we pay a quarter of taxes is profit tax, good taxation, a quarter is VAT, which is more or less good, okay, and then half of the tax is totally regressive consumer, per phone, per SIM card, etc., per minute, etc., which just hits the bottom of the pyramid and only hits the poor. This is, of course, a big dilemma, because that's where you very often end up. To the question side, or to the more political side, which is more for the ministry than for the researchers maybe, is that much of the lack of taxation is also chosen by design in these states. For example, that landowners are exempt from tax, state companies are exempt from tax, textile industry, military companies, or that profit shifting, for example, is very widespread, for example, in state-owned companies. So there is a lot, of course, to be attacked. Great tribute to your focus on avoiding local and fragmented taxations, as we heard from Republic of Congo. But politically chosen lack of taxation is important, and progressiveness, progressive, and three P's that we need in the field, and which basically bar any development that we want to achieve in society.
Yeah, this was a very timely input, because the previous question was about these digital companies, and here we got a response how Telenor is addressing it. And in the previous session, one of the key points that came out was the need for partnerships between public sector, private sector, and civil society, and not least research. And you know, I'm looking at my colleague at NORAD. You know, if we could look at ways in which we could look for partnerships in this domain as well, to try to look for the good solutions with private companies as Telenor, with concrete experiences in a wide range of countries, and researchers, and you know, tax. Just the last speakers there just provide an example of a possible partnership.
Hello, my name is Wolfred. I'm a retired civil servant of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So my question is related to, I mean, sort of the tendency for us to talk in a rather paternalistic way and be surprisingly optimistic social engineering guys. So my question is, where do you put national research, knowledge, information in the fragile states themselves, in the we build equation? Thank you.
Beate Bull, I work at NORA in the section for governance, human rights and fertility. I'm wondering also if support in terms of taxation systems in fragile states should also include, well, not only have the focus on collecting the taxes and all the considerations one has to take into account, but also how to transparency in terms of spending the collected taxes in terms of also as a means to build trust and legitimacy.
And before I give the word to the panel, I would also like to invite my co-convener here, Eric Eiring. Do you have a question?
Thank you, Hege. Yeah, so my name is Eric Eiring. I will start working for NORAD in August. I have also done some work for NORAD before on fragile states. So I did a mapping of how development agencies can approach tax work in fragile states. One of my takeaways from this work is that we cannot proceed as we have done for the last decades. We have to find new ways of thinking, new ways of working. Of course, technology is one factor that could transform how we work and how we deliver and what we deliver. But my question to the panel is, so based on both your academic experience but also your practical experience, you're all very practiced in the field, do you have any advice to us development agencies on how we can force ourselves to think new and do things in a new way in order to have better results when doing something as complex as building better tax systems in fragile states?
Yes, and Ola, would you like to Yeah, Olav is you've been working on these issues for a long time, and perhaps you would.
Yes, I think there have been a lot of good questions, so I'm not sure if I have to add anything particular, but of course there are a lot of issues that have been mentioned. I think one issue that some maybe have touched upon that I would like to maybe reinforce for food of thought and some discussion is in terms of the evidence base and the research base for what we are recommending. I think several of the questions are alluding to this. And you had in your presentation also mentioned how the IMF has thought about entering into fiscal issues in fragile states. But I would sort of venture the hypothesis a little bit that a lot of what we are recommending, of course it's not only in the field of taxation but in other areas as well, is not very solid in terms of that we know what works, under what conditions, and what are critical or necessary conditions. So I think, really, I mean, how can we be better prepared when we enter into such difficult conditions to have an evidence base and do something that is really anchored in knowledge and not just what we think work and what IMF has done modeling and simulations on, but we don't really know based on historical experience what worked.
Thank you. And now we've heard from civil society, we've heard from Telenor, a large platform company, and I'd like to invite the final question from a small startup.
I got a question. This is from the single Norway, which has been doing some taxation in DRC for the last 2 years. What we see is actually something that was commented is the informal taxes. A lot of informal taxes is provided to the poor people. So actually, how can we actually look upon this from a broader perspective, actually putting everything together and actually find a simpler plan? Actually, what is the Western world's way of looking at taxation, but find a taxation model which fits the local community?
And if I have understood your project right, you have made a system for tax collection of property taxation in Democratic Republic of Congo, which is a daunting challenge in itself, and you produced some good results, but then also encountered some problems with corruption, local corruption, and also experiences on what you should have needed in better partnerships on a broader alliances. So with this variety of input, questions and comments, I would like to invite the panel for some final comments.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for very many good questions and also reflections. Some of the issues you have raised we have addressed in the report. Others would definitely be very beneficial if we would develop the study further. The issue of building legitimacy was raised by several of the commentators here. How to build a legitimate tax system. One issue was whether the use of a more transparent way of reporting what taxes have been collected where and how taxes are spent might be a way. Will that help? Yes, it might help. But just informing people about how much taxes they pay and how much taxes collected by the national or the subnational level may actually in some cases be counterproductive if that is not, if people don't see that actually these revenues collected are translated into public services or infrastructure. That has been a challenge. I think we have addressed that also in the context of the EITI. But to take the tax system forward in these very difficult settings, I think it's very important that the agents of change are aware of this, that there must be some visible improvements in services. They can start very simple, like in urban areas, by just providing street lighting or street cleaning. So the businesses operating in these areas feel, okay, this is beneficial because it's more attractive for customers, go, the security is better. And there are cases where this has been a starting point for building a more legitimate tax system. The issue of corruption is also related to legitimacy. And the issue of corruption is something we have emphasized also in the report, that in this, the countries we are talking about, corruption is massive, it's extensive. It is very difficult to map out who is most corrupt or less corrupt. I think this is a matter of life, and one has to also then probably also to manage in this sector and not accept corruption, but realize it is a part of the daily life. The issue of how do you address this? Of course, this is something which again is very context specific, but one issue which we have seen in some countries is that simplification of the tax spend, simplification of the tax structure, and more clear, simple tax legislation is an approach which at least reduces the opportunities for corruption. And digitalization also can be, in some cases, effective, can work, but the challenge of maintaining some of the new software and digital methods which have been developed is that it needs a local champion. Someone is driving it, someone which gives, provides the legitimacy to using it. And if that champion, whether it can be a provincial governor or a minister or whoever, is leaving or is withdrawing his or her support, then one risks that very positive efforts which was initiated may collapse. There are so many examples of this across, I mainly work in Africa, that digital solutions have been launched with big fanfare. They worked for a period, but thereafter they have not been sustained.
And I think that was the case. You had a local governor, and then that was changed. And then, was that the case? Or? Yeah. And then you have to start all over again. So if I may invite you, Jalia, for some comments. Yeah? Okay. Okay, Morten first.
No, just go ahead. I just wanted to signal that I also wanted to address some of this.
Yeah.
But Carla, go ahead.
Okay, I'm not addressing everything.
Yeah. And we're running out of time, but this is so interesting, so I'm sure that...
Yeah, I'd like to just really underline the comment that the retired professor made in terms of where do you put local knowledge, where do you put local research? And like I said, I think this is really important, to go to a place knowing that you're not the only knowledge provider. The people in the local context have a lot of knowledge. So it's going into a place knowing that you're bringing different types of knowledge to this, and many times the only way this is going to work is if you work with each other and if you're open to listening and learning from what the other side is saying, because there is so much that is available in those systems that we often downplay. The other thing that I wanted to comment about just briefly in terms of complex systems, like, you know, do you do blunt or do you do, and I think, I personally think start with simple. It becomes easier. We found, there's research that we did recently in Uganda on taxing high net worth individuals, and we found that it was really helpful for us to just go with the simple things that work, that were ready to be taken up, and that people had ownership of. If we had gone into the complex and said, this person said this person said this person said this, like, so let's start with what is simple and what's doable, and you work towards and understand the context, because the context is going to be really difficult. And I'm happy to provide more comments and reactions, but
we're actually over time already, and Morten Bøås, he's my favorite researcher. Whatever subject there is, I try to bring him in on the panel, so that's why I also feel that I can be kind of tough with it. So you'll have very short time, Morten, as the final punchlines.
Final punchline. Well, the final punchline would be to say that concerning the relationship between corruption and taxation, well, I mean, there isn't any choice. We need, if taxation regimes are to be brought into these countries or improved in these countries, it will have to take place under widespread corruption, because there is no alternative to that. I mean, this corruption is not going to just disappear overnight. We can wish that it will disappear, but it's going to be there for a considerable amount of time, because it will be a very huge effort changing not only elite behavior, but in fact a political and economic culture into which people, for the lack of any other opportunity, has had to become socialized into. So this is not going to disappear overnight. But what hopefully can happen is that if people start to seeing some small benefits from the fact that they actually are paying taxes, because they are forced to pay taxes, but they start seeing some small benefits. A street that is cleaned, suddenly some lamp lights that starts working, just some small things may change something, not necessarily the issue of legitimacy, which is very complex, but it could make people start trusting again, a trust in the place they live, but also a trust in what we may call future time, which has more or less disappeared in a place like, for example, Mali, but also a lot of the same things could be said about the DRC. Because, yes, it's a problem that tax becomes regressive, but I mean, in a way, that's how it has always started. Tax started when feudal lords started to tax poor people in order to build up a future base, in order to wage war, basically. This is how it started. But still, even if it starts regressively, it establishes a relationship that was not there previously. And even the research that I and others have done on insurgencies and insurgency taxation, for example from the Congo, shows that this changes things from a completely unpredictable loot and plunder relationship, which isn't a relationship, to a relationship of some sort between the insurgency and the local population that they taxes. Is this immensely uneven relationship? Yes, it is, but it's still a sort of a relationship that gradually may start changing things. And this is how I think we need to start thinking about this. Which means that we need a better evidence base, we need a larger evidence base, but we also need to, in fact, face up to the fact, both we as researchers, but also the donor community and the various national stakeholders, that for some time this will in fact be extreme sport. We are moving into unknown territory, and also the donors need to accept this. And the reason why we need to accept this is simply that there isn't an alternative, because the alternative is to keep these places on a permanent artificial life support system, and that is not going to work. Also because there is so much impatience in various local populations. They want to see something else. And here we have to face up to the fact that this is also very much what we are involved in, is in a way a struggle of proving relevance and proving that our, for lack of a better word, state project is better than alternative violent projects. So this is where we are right now, and we need to work together with people in these areas, particularly with regard to with researchers in places like Mali, DRC, and so on. Lot of young, talented people who are very eager to work on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone, to the panelists, and the panelists will still be here, so I'm sure that it will be possible for interactions. And it's been fantastic to hear all of you, and thank you again, Doctor, for coming all the way from UK to partake in this valuable session, and we will need your perspectives going forward as well, because this is just the start, and here we have the research foundation that we will build our policies on going forward. So thank you all.